Hello, welcome everyone. Let me know if there are any issues with the sound. I know that, I have my window open, so, and there's a little bit of wind, so maybe I can uh, mitigate a little bit of wind. Um, cool. Hopefully it will not be a problem. Cool. Oh, give me 1 second. Yeah, so delivery. Let's see. I think I'll open this live and see. Was it a bomb? Oh no. That is. I know what it is. Yes. Great. So I actually ordered a book about an introduction to Hegel, oh, which is just basically me saying, hey, I am pretty overwhelmed by Hegel. I'm scared of him, so I think I need to come prepared. And just a friend, I think actually Ernesto recommended me this one. It's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel from Alexandre Koheve. I probably destroyed the pronunciation of that word, but yeah. So hopefully, this will be a great way to understand Hegel, and then I could go with the phenomenology of the spirit without too much. Well, obviously, I'll need to work on understanding that, but at least I won't come empty-handed. So, uh, thank you all for coming. I was a little bit hesitant to stream today because I know that there are a lot of shit. There's a lot of shit happening, especially I know in the United States. They're deporting massively uh, people, working class people, from just with terrorizing tactics, quite fascist tactics. Where people are I watched a video of a mom that she went to pick her kids from school, and there were undercover ICE agents there, um, and they just took her. They took the kid from her arms, and then they just uh, they just took her away. So I mean, that was pretty brutal to see, so close from home, um, because I know that there's quite a lot of people that and even if it's not a thing that, like, even if they're legal or not illegal, it doesn't really matter. As in, like, the legal uh, framework of the conversation, it's just to separate families over. It's just literally their color of skin and the ethnicity, right? Because in the end, there were a lot of people that were, uh, you know, an illegal process of being just, I mean, again, legal, as legal residents of the United States, and just ICE officials just didn't care. Like migration just took them away, even if you were in the middle of, the process, and we're almost done with it. They were waiting for you, um, and I don't know. I just wanted to bring this out the table. That's why I was hesitant to stream, because I know that, or stream about, continuing this, but I know that in a way, the labor theory of value, which is the chapter two, has quite a lot of, you know a thing to do with migrants, right, and their work, and um, I just don't want to leave that uh, from the conversation, right? Because um, we, I mean, a lot of people know that the efforts of legalizing, and I mean quote unquote, because I know that I don't believe that people should be illegal, right? I understand the need for borders, uh, but it's still, pretty brutal to say you should not exist in this place. Uh, so this the status of people working in, you know uh, not a reference to the Beatles, but the strawberry fields, or any agricultural job that implies that needs workers to pick up the fruits of the labor, quite literally. um, they're underpaid, right? Because it's easier. It's just, you're just blackmailing people to get them to do a certain job, underpaid, living under the minimum wage, and capitalism does not want that, right? Because capitalism thrives um, with slave labor. Like, the less you pay your workers, the more you can get uh, from them. That's like the main thing that you're looking for. You're just trying to spend less money on people. In general, the production costs, you need to bring them down so that you can maximize profits, and that's basically it. So when people, when politicians say to you, we don't want immigrants, and they're not actually looking for a way for them to be legal, that's just because, you already know. So capitalism thrives on their underpaid labor, and they're actually, like, a lot of people that right now, I think I was listening to a case. Shit, I don't remember which one was it, which source was it, but they were talking about someone that they so ICE took them, and then they need to be they need to, like, I think they're I mean, I guess they're detained, right? And it was a migrant agricultural worker, right? So they detain him, and then he needed his phone call to call their families, right, to let them know, like, what the hell's happening, and they were paying him $1 a day for field work, right? So, and the phone call costs $5. So he had to work 5 days a week so he could call his family, which to me is insane. Like, I mean, and it's not a. I don't even talk to my family that much. I mean, I do message them, right, sometimes, but there can be sometimes where I don't, and that's okay, right? But for people in a situation where they're quite literally, between the sword and the wall. I don't know if that's the correct translation from that phrase. Entre la espada y la pared. Um, it has to be like nerve wracking, uh, incredibly stressful, and just for your family to not know, for your family to know that you're being detained, and having to wait like days in order to find out if you're actually still there or not, in the middle of like a fascist takeover with policies, with these kind of policies. It's just insane. So anyway, I just want to say that I feel for all the migrants, for the Mexicans, for the Mexican ancestries, and all the Latinos in general that are suffering, and all the people, basically, all the people that are suffering these detentions and these deportations. I feel for them. My heart is with you, and honestly, I just hope everything, just they stop doing this, because it's literally tearing families apart. Um, and yeah. Anyways, that's just that's just my take. So hopefully I'll be able to continue mentioning this topic. I'll be sure to add a few images and videos to the post that I'm gonna do after we finish chapter 2 of Hadas Thier's book, which is actually, again, it's this one. Yeah, it's the same book. If you're interested, you can actually let me open Discord and share with you guys the link to the server, because I shared the link. Yeah, there it is. Cool. That's linked to Discord. I posted in the chat so you can access it, and then you can join. And if you go to hashtag biblioteca, which is, the answer to the question, ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? You'll find that the latest post, the latest comment is me saying, hey, here's the PDF. So if you're interested in reading it with us, perfect. That's great. So without further ado, I will begin. Just give me 1 second. I think I need to maybe share a little bit. Yeah. Wait. I will share the link of the stream again for people in the chat. Sorry, in my in other groups, basically. Let me look for a little bit more, and then I will continue the stream. Cool, great. Oh, and then let me post it also into our stream. Great. Add link. Let's link. We're live. Cool. Great. Now we can begin. So, chapter 2, the labor theory of value. Oh, by the way, let me know if the audio works. So I know that sometimes we have issues, us streamers. So, She starts with a quote from Marx from Capital. It says, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties." Niceties, yes. Um, it is absolutely clear that by his activity, man changes the forms of the materials of nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of it. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary sensuous thing. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, which is sold in the market, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, far more wonderful than if it were to begin dancing of its own free will. This is from Capital, Volume 1. Now the subchapter, the cellular structure of capitalism. The opening line of Karl Marx's Capital is, "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elemental form." It may sound prescient of late-stage capitalism's hoarding disorders, but even in Marx's day, as capitalism was developing and growing in pockets of Western Europe, the world was already overflowing with commodities. Yeah. Goods for sale on the market. By the way, I find it funny. I just remember that opening line of Karl Marx's Capital, which is, "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities." It's funny because a lot of people, especially liberals, although libertarians, say, well, actually, Karl Marx never talked about capitalism, sorry. And that just demonstrates to me one thing. And even they say, like, I read Marx. Of course I read Marx, and then I criticized it because it's just a bunch of bullshit. And then they say, he actually never talked about capitalism. And I'm like, dude, what do you think the political economy is? And then you read the first line of the opening line of Capital, and it's like, dude, like you can't be more obvious that Marx was talking about capitalism. And then they just turn it away and say, well, actually I meant to coin the term, but that's just being stupid. Anyways, that happens a lot. I've noticed. So Marx began his study of capitalism by examining commodities, which he saw as its building blocks. In this chapter, we'll investigate these blocks and, through their examination, work through the Marxist understanding of value and the role of labor. At first glance, a commodity appears to be simple enough. We are surrounded daily by hundreds of thousands of commodities all about us. From the food that we buy at the grocery store to knickknacks that clutter our apartments to the apartments themselves, all these commodities and an infinite number more are bought and sold on the market. Simply put, a commodity is defined as something that was made through human labor, satisfies a demand, and is produced for the purpose of exchange. If I bake a loaf of bread to eat, then it's just bread. But if I bake it in order to sell it, then the loaf becomes a commodity. Production has existed throughout history. Human beings have always labored to make things, tools, food, clothing, shelter, in order to survive. Things manufactured Mined or grown were not commodities, however, as long as they were made for direct use, rather than to be sold on the market. In hunter-gatherer societies, production was organized for use and consumption by the producers themselves. In feudal societies, peasants were the primary producers. They harvested crops for themselves as well as surplus product for the lord. In the current system, goods are not made for the personal consumption of the workers or bosses of a particular business. They are made for the purpose of exchange, that is, to be sold and to be bought and sold. Workers at Apple don't come home with fistfuls of iPhones. Nor did Steve Jobs live in a castle of iPads. Apple products are manufactured for sale on the market. The separation of production from consumption is unique to capitalism and was inconceivable in earlier times because needs were so immediate. A vast distance now exists between the maker and the user of a particular good. Each is anonymous to the other. So, whenever people, and by people I mean, again, liberals or anti-communists, or whoever has that discourse ingrained in their psyche, whenever they say, well, you know, why are you a socialist? Why are you a communist? Why are you a leftist? If you have an iPad, right? Which is quite funny because, you know, it's pretty clear that, you know, Steve Jobs or Tim Cook didn't, you know, build the product itself. He didn't come up with, you know, all the ideas for it. He didn't come up with the design itself. He's just the CEO, right? He administers the capital of Apple, you know, as a company. And the ones that literally do the work are the workers, right? So, I mean, in a stupid sense, I think, I guess if I have an iPhone, I'm supporting the workers, right? But obviously, no, it's more complicated than that. Because, you know, workers get exploited, and their labor is basically abused and taken, right? And that is interesting because it says that, you know, here the separation from the people that produce stuff and the product itself is real because in feudal societies, if you remember the previous episode, we talked about people that were self-sustained, right? So the serfs, the people that the campesinos, the agricultural workers, forgot the term in English. They produced the food, right? Their own food, and the excess of production of that food went to the feudal lords, right, as a tribute, so that they could continue living on the land. But you know, that was it. There was no separation from the product itself to the worker because the workers were themselves, and the consumers were also themselves. Here, it's different. Um, so, as Marxist theorist Ernest Mandel wrote, someone who essentially produces in order to satisfy his own needs or those of his community lives by the products of his own labor. Production and products, labor and products of labor are identical for him. In practice, as in his mind. In practice, as in his mind. In commodity production, this unity is broken. The producer of commodities no longer lives directly on the products of his own labor. On the contrary, he can live only if he gets rid of these products. By looking at who produces what and how it will be consumed, we begin the process of uncovering the structure of capitalism. It may seem like a tedious place to start, but it's where Marx begins Capital. He explains why in the preface. The value form, the value of commodities, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it, while on the other hand, there has been at least an approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. But why? Because the complete body is easier to study than its cells. But for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. Great. Now we go to a next subchapter, and I will remind you that we are on page 29 if you're reading in the PDF. If you want to read in the PDF, you can click on the Discord link that I shared in the chat. If you're not able to access it, let me know. And then if you go to the Biblioteca, you will see that the PDF is right there for you to access and read with us. So, the dual character of a commodity. If the defining aspect of commodities is that they are produced for exchange, we are immediately faced with a conundrum. How are they exchanged? What determines their values in relation to other commodities? Marx distinguished between two different kinds of values that we can attribute to goods: use values and exchange values. An item's use value is how it is used. The use value of bread is that it provides nourishment. The use value of a chair is that it can be sat upon. And the use value of this book is that you can read it, get knowledge. And so on, as Zizek would say, regardless of whether that item is sold on the market. It still has a use value if it is useful to someone. All societies have thus produced use values, regardless of whether those items have been commodities to be exchanged. And even in our current capitalist system, some use values like air are still not commodities. A few expensive novelty jars of fresh air, notwithstanding, capitalism has not figured out how to bottle up and sell us the air that we breathe, right? But you can buy farts in a jar in the market. So I guess that is air. So Marx placed no judgment on what it means for something to be useful. He wrote, "The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Nor does it matter how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of subsistence, which is as an object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production, which is to produce other commodities. At the end of the day, something has a use value if anyone wants or has want or need for it. Whether it is something as vital as bread, as destructive as drone bombers, or as trivial as your 1980s garbage Pale Kids and 1990s Beanie Babies collections. I guess Funko Pops also, fall into that category. Let me drink a little bit of water. Some use values are universal. We all need air. We all need nourishment of some sort, whether it comes from rice, kale, or cookies. But other use values are geographically, culturally, and historically determined. Whether there is a need or want from a product is not a fixed or evenly determined measurement. People living in the suburbs probably need a lawnmower, hedge clippers, and gardening tools. But someone living in an apartment in New York City is unlikely to have want or space for such items. The changing and often subjective utility of commodities is one of the reasons why it cannot be the determinant of how much something is worth on the market. For more, sidebar margin. Okay, yeah, she's quoting the the marginally useless theory, which is comes later in the book. Okay, cool. Since a single commodity can often be more or less useful to different people, each person, the logic follows, would be willing to pay different amounts for a particular good. The muffins at your local coffee shop would have to be sold at varying prices based on the hunger level of each customer. Even accounting for average needs, or in cases where the hierarchy of utilities more fixed, it makes no sense as a measure of exchange value. If it were, bread would be more expensive than cars, and certainly more so than diamonds. What then determines the relative value of goods? Sorry, that was a question. Sometimes I just don't like the English. You only have to have the question mark at the end. I feel like it's more useful, especially for reading, to know exactly when the question starts. Okay. To answer this question, Marx distinguishes between an item's use value and its exchange value. The quantity with which one commodity exchanges for another commodity. Whereas use values are qualitative in nature, it matters a lot to me whether something is a chair or a loaf of bread before I sit on it. Exchange values are purely quantitative. How many loaves of bread make up a monetary equivalent of a single chair? Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin summed up Marx's approach this way. A commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. Exchange value is, first of all, the ratio, the proportion in which a certain number of use values of one kind can be exchanged for a certain number of use values of another kind. Daily experience shows us that millions upon millions of such exchanges are constantly equating with one another in every kind of use value, even the most diverse and incomparable. These millions upon millions, now trillions upon trillions, of exchanges make the daily life and breath of capitalism. The process of exchange of commodities is itself a historical condition. So long as trade between tribes or individuals was casual or episodic, there was no need to have clear measurements of relative values. But once regular networks of exchange and local markets took root, so too did the need for precise costs. As Marx explained, the exchange of commodities begins where communities have their boundaries, at their points of contact with other communities. However, as soon as products have become commodities in the external relations of a community, they also, by reaction, become so in the internal life of the community. Their quantitative exchange relation is at first determined purely by chance. They become exchangeable through the mutual desire of their owners to alienate them. In the meantime, the need for other subjects of utility gradually establishes itself. The constant repetition of exchange makes it a normal social process. In the course of time, therefore, at least some part of the products must be produced especially for the purpose of exchange. So production of things just for the sake of exchanging it. And I think of, for example, I don't know if you've seen, well, obviously, I think you're all familiar with Timu, and if not, then you should be. So Timu is like, it's just basically like extreme capitalism, in the sense that it's this Chinese app that is constantly prompting you to add items to your cart and to buy, and lets you know that there's like 80% discounts constantly. But it obviously comes with a trick, which is that your average ticket should be at least like 1,000 pesos, which are like, I don't know, like $50 something. Um, so, and then it's just a bunch of shit, right? So you have like a package of like 50 cheap metal rings on sale for like 10 pesos, which is just ridiculously low. It's like 50 cents, I guess, of a dollar. Um, 10, 20 pesos or something. And it's just, so it's just obviously, like, you think, okay, so the fact that they created this like, rings don't really cost like, at what other place, like, you can even see if you go to Amazon, for example, and you see the same rings, literally the same rings, in like, I don't know, that package could have cost like 200 pesos, right, instead of 10 or 20. um, so you see that tendency of like just exchanging things for the sake of exchanging things, and continuing, to uh, circulate capital constantly. So yeah, interesting. Okay, so Marx continues. From the moment that distinction from that moment, the distinction between the usefulness of things for direct consumption and their usefulness in exchange becomes firmly established. Their use value becomes distinguished from their exchange value. On the other hand, the quantitative proportion in which the things are exchangeable becomes dependent on their production itself. Custom fixes their values at definite magnitudes. Capitalist societies organized around the quantitative exchange values of goods, rather than the qualitative human need for use values. While you and I are primarily concerned with the use value of items, uh, yeah, rather than okay, yeah, whether we can sit on a chair or on a loaf of bread, a capitalist does not care what an item's use is, so long as it will make him money. That's as simple as that. So use values only matter to capitalists insofar as they know they must produce something that can be sold, and useless things can't be sold. But what matters most is exchange value. How much money can be made from selling those goods? Put another way, the use value of grain and whether there are people that need to eat is not the system's main concern. Rather, its exchange value is what matters. Whether and for how much grain can be exchanged. And so, capitalism is responsible for such grotesque events as dumping grain reserves into the ocean rather than selling at a loss in order to feed hungry people. At the same time, boundless quantities of plastics and disposable everything are churned out without any regard for human and environmental consequences. The question of how exchange value is determined is therefore critical to understanding what makes capitalism tick. The common sense assumption in our society is that exchange value is somehow an innate characteristic of a product. An average car, for instance, is unquestioningly just worth about $30,000. Yet there is no physical manifestation of this value. You can inspect the materiality of a car all you like, but you won't see or feel or weigh the exchange value. So far, no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or diamond. Measuring physical qualities clearly does us no good in the realm of exchange. How do you compare a block of cheese with a bike? If we were trading hay for hay, that would be simple. We could put them on a scale against each other and determine an equal weight for fair exchange. Of course, that would be pointless exchange. It's the difference between use values that makes them exchangeable. So, what would you use this versus what would I use that you're offering me? And yet, we obviously can't weigh a bushel of hay against a vat of soup to determine the rate of exchange. How then can two things that possess incommensurable qualities can be compared or equated? The one property that all commodities have in common and through which their value can be determined is that each is a product of human labor. In Marx's words, despite their motley appearance, commodities have a common denominator. Commodities can exchange according to the relative amount of labor time that it takes to produce them. This basic idea is the core concept behind what's known as the labor theory of value, explained further below. Water break. Let me see, we have a couple of people watching. If you're interested or if you have nothing to do, you can share as well the stream. Would appreciate that. Or just have it on the background while you're doing stuff. That helps a lot. Okay. But before turning our attention there, one final point about the dual nature of commodities, use values and exchange values. Use values. Okay, yeah. Let me read that again. Sorry. It's just that it's weird because I have two screens, but then I have this odd mania where I am looking at myself and I'm like at the other side, which is, I know it's mirrored, but yeah. So, and I have the camera right there. So I just need to try to concentrate. And instead of looking at myself, I need to be looking at the camera whenever I talk. So I will try to do just quick reorganizing here. And I will continue. Okay. Great. Now, where was I? Okay. So before turning our attention there, one final point about the dual nature of commodities. Use values and exchange values. The difference, contradiction between and unity of quality, which is use value, and quantity, value, is a recurring theme in Volume 1 of Capital. One type of value does not cause the other. Parenthesis, how useful an item is does not determine its value on the market, nor does its value on the market determine how useful an item may be to us. Yet, despite this lack of causality, the two values of a commodity impact each other and are inseparable. As Marxist economist David Harvey put it, the commodity, a singular concept, has two aspects, but you can't cut the commodity in half and say that's the exchange value, that's the use value, and that's the use value. No, the commodity is a unity, but within that unity there is a dual aspect. Actually, David Harvey, I was listening to a conference of his. Actually, I didn't even reach 1/3 of it because I went running while I was listening to it. Let me look for it. I want to share it because I know that's. He has a book which I haven't read yet, but I know that it's about. Oh wait, I have it on my other account. Yeah, let me change my account. He has a book called A Companion to Marx's Capital, I think. And yeah, he has this conference from the People's Forum, New York City. So I will paste it in the chat as well in case you're interested and you can look into it. Definitely. I like because he's pretty clear on how he's explaining concepts and in general. Yeah. So pretty lucid, if you ask me. So, okay. So there's a dual aspect in the commodity. A thing can be a use value without having an exchange value. If you make a pie, it will be of use to you as you eat it, but unless you put it up for sale, it has no exchange value. At the same time, a thing cannot have an exchange value if it does not have a use value. Something cannot be things that cannot be used are worthless. If you make a bunch of foul, inedible pies for sale at the local market, and if no one has use for foul, inedible pies, then these pies will also have no exchange value, no matter how long it took you to make them. The item does not have to be useful to the person or people who produce them, but they have to be useful to someone in order to have an exchange value. And that's the purpose of having a market, to find a buyer who will have use for what you've created. In fact, it's precisely the fact that an item has no use value to its producer that allows it to be an exchange value. If a tailor sews a coat to wear, she can't very well sell it to someone else at the same time. An item that has a use value to the tailor can simultaneously have an exchange value for sale. But if she makes two coats and can realistically only wear one, the fact that the second coat is redundant and therefore has no use value to the tailor is exactly what gives it the potential to be an exchange value. Simply put, you can either live in your house or you can sell your house. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And this is the thing that she was quoting, the sidebar, which is called A Marginally Useless Theory, ? The predominant explanation of value in mainstream economics today is the neoclassical theory of marginalism. It assumes that a commodity's worth is determined by laws of supply and demand, mediated by what they term marginal utility. This theory argues that value is established on the one hand by individuals maximizing the amount of utility or benefit that they get from purchasing a good. And on the other hand, a corporation maximizing the amount of profit they can achieve through producing and selling those goods. Where these two values meet determines the cost of a product. To understand the logic of decision making in the marginalist model, we took an economy with just two actors, a buyer and a seller. Roughly speaking, the basic premise of marginal utility is that consumers demand goods in order to gain maximum benefits from their use. A thirsty person wants a bottle of water in order to quench their thirst. The more bottles of water our thirsty friend buys, the more thirst-quenching utility she gains. However, at a certain point, as she gets to feeling more hydrated, each additional bottle of water brings in diminishing returns. While she may have been willing to pay $2.50 or $3 desperate for that first bottle of water, by the third bottle, she's unlikely to pay more than $1. And by the sixth bottle, doubtless she would pay anything at all, thus reaching maximum utility. If we were to chart the amount of money she is willing to spend on bottles of water, we could construct a demand curve. One of the early theoreticians of marginal utility, Stanley Jevons, explained, "Repeated reflection and inquiry has led me to the somewhat novel opinion that value depends entirely upon utility. The more a consumer wants something, the more utility it has for her, the more she is willing to pay for it. Water," he wrote, "may be roughly described as the most useful of all substances. A quart of water per day has the high utility of saving a person from dying in a most distressing manner. Several gallons a day may possess much utility for such purpose as cooking and washing, but after an adequate supply is secured for these uses, any additional quantity is a matter of indifference." Figure says supply and demand, so demand goes down, supply goes up, which is, here it is. If you can see it in my small cut circle. The company producing bottled water, on the other hand, measures its marginal cost to see how much it would cost to increase production by each additional bottle of water. The marginal cost, then, is the cost of producing one more unit of a commodity. It would include any additional costs, more labor power, more equipment, or factory space for the next additional unit. Plotting the cost of production for each additional unit allows us to construct a supply curve. And where the supply curve and the demand curve meet, we find an equilibrium for prices and quantities of goods produced. There are some complicated assumptions involved in going from the two-actor market to the infinite-actor market of the world of perfect competition. But this simple outline gets to the heart of the neoclassical logic. Unfortunately, this theory raises more questions than it answers. First, the supply curve assumes that the marginal costs of production rise for every output increase. In their model, production costs keep rising, and therefore, the only factor that can lead a capitalist to increase production levels would be generating higher income from demand. In reality, as we'll discuss in Chapter 5, this is a faulty claim, as scaling up production usually increases efficiencies and reduces the cost of production per item. Perhaps more fundamentally troubling to the neoclassical model is that marginalists assume that their model works equally for the commodity of labor power. But labor power is a special commodity under capitalism, and workers, the sellers of that commodity, operate with a different set of motivations. Under capitalism, workers are given the choice to work or starve. This is a pretty big difference from a company selling water bottles, which can decide to simply walk away from a transaction and not sell if the price drops too low. Depending on the state of labor of market and the level of class struggle, workers' ability to walk away from such a transaction can be very limited. Given the fact that most people living in our society spend our waking lives producing and selling our labor power as our only commodity, this is a pretty serious flaw in the neoclassical logic. Above all, the neoclassical theory conveniently assumes that values are not determined by labor time, but by subjective valuations and desires. Capitalism is reduced, in sum, to individual behaviors and decisions. In this paradigm, explained Marxist blogger Brendan Cooney, rather than a theory of classes, we have a theory of pure individuals, all seen as equals in the market. This shift in bourgeois economics was a deliberate attempt to undermine the labor theory of value. Classical economics was developed during capitalism's infancy, before class struggles were seen as a threat to the new order. Neoclassical economics, on the other hand, afraid of growing working class power, degenerated into apologetics. As one economist expressed it in 1832, that labor is the sole source of wealth seems to be a doctrine that labor is the sole source of wealth seems to be a doctrine as dangerous as it is false, as it unhappily affords a handle to those who would represent all property as belonging to the working classes, and the share which is received by others as a robbery or fraud upon them. The fashionable theory just now here is that of Stanley Jevons, wrote Engels at the time, according to which value is determined by utility and, on the other hand, by the limit of supply, which is the cost of production. I.e. the cost of production, which is merely a confused and circuitous way of saying that value is determined by supply and demand. Vulgar economy everywhere. We then go to another subchapter, which is called Not by Gold or by Silver, but by Labor. And before I continue, let me have a drink. Great. Now, continue. Let me see if... Just curious, because sometimes I see people subscribing, and I haven't seen anyone right now. So, I'm not complaining, by the way. This is just to see if everything is working as it should on the stream framing captures. Yeah, subs are... Yeah, okay. They're there. We're connected. Cool. Now, not by gold or by silver, but by labor. Labor, the creator of use values, in Marx's words, has been a permanent feature of the human existence. Some kind of expenditure of physical or mental energy is necessary to create the conditions for our species' survival. Shelter, clothes, machines, tools, food, and on. In Marx's words, it is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. This is... I want to reflect a little bit on this. There's a lot of hate against Marx himself as a figure, as a person, and usually a lot of people say, "Hey, he was just lazy. He never worked, and he just hated humanity for no reason, right? There's a book called, and I don't know if it has an English translation because I mean, yeah, I'm gonna be real with you. Uh, English speaking means uh, it's pretty difficult to get Marxist um, theory books in your America, basically. That's what I'm saying. Uh, because, for example, in Mexico, different from America, we had a lot of socialist and communist um, leaders, uh, during and after the Mexican Revolution that had I mean, they cover a lot of ground in terms of their work, like written work. Uh, and so they were relatively free to do, uh, to continue their studies and share um, their work. So, and there's this psychoanalyst called Eric Fromm, which I'm sure that you've known him because he has written also. He lived in the United States. He was actually part of, I think, was McCarthy's campaign at one point, um, and he wrote this book called Marx and His Concept of Man. I'm just doing a literal translation of the title in Spanish, but it's literally that. So basically, Eric Fromm is a psychoanalyst, and he, just applies psychoanalysis to Marx and to the way that he perceived human, like man, as humanity, right? Um, and it is very beautiful because Marx really saw the potential of liberation uh, through work, right? But not work in the capitalist sense, in like selling your work to live, right? Just as a condition of living, but as a liberating exercise to free to empty your, I don't know if that's the correct term, your psyche, your most um your innermost thoughts and ideology on whatever you're thinking into an object. So materializing your will into the object that you're working on, which I think is pretty poetic, right? Pretty romantic. And I think that this quote that which the Hadas uh, quotes, which is a condition of human existence, which is labor, basically. Labor is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself, right? So uh, becomes man needs labor, right? Labor as you doing the work, because work keeps you, it's not that work keeps you busy, uh, but it's just that work mediates uh, life itself. Continuing, the wealth of society, argued Marx, comes from human labor and from nature. Labor, he argued at the start of the critique of the Gotha program, is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely of such that material wealth consists as labor. which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. Marx understood wealth to mean the things that we need to live, survive, and thrive, as distinct from value, which is a characteristic we assign to commodities and is socially constructed. As socialist author Paul D'Amato argued, value is not really a thing, but a historically evolved relation between human beings that takes the fantastic form of a relation between things. Value is a meaningless category outside of market relations. We can see that labor is necessary to create the various use values that make up the wealth of society. But the labor imbued in goods made for sale, commodities, has added role as a measure of exchange value. How does it fulfill the latter function? Some amount of labor is necessary to power the production of every commodity. In that sense, as we've said it, it is the common denominator across all goods. The cost to society of making a given commodity, its value, can be measured by the amount of labor devoted to its production. And exchange value is a quantitative representation of that value. Roughly, if it takes 10 times as long to make a chair as it does a loaf of bread, that would make a chair about 10 times more valuable. To become an effective means of measurement, the labor imbued in commodities has to become generalized. Specific work like baking or woodworking has to be replaced with quantities of generic, or abstract, as Marx calls it, labor time. The real concrete labor that has gone into producing a commodity is too varied and complex to be used as a measurement for comparison. But all acts of labor can be boiled down, as Marxist economist David McNally put it, to expenditures of the general human capacity to exert muscles, energies, and brain cells to create or produce something. Even if all commodities come into being through different acts of concrete labor, they nonetheless all share the property of being products of the generic act of human labor, or what Marx calls it, abstract labor. Labor as a general power abstracted from all its specific forms. Marx used his favorite example of a commodity, linen, to explain the point in Capital. Human labor creates value, but it's not itself value. It becomes value in its coagulated state, in objective form. The value of the linen as a congealed mass of human labor can be expressed only as an objectivity, a thing which is materially different from the linen itself, and yet common to the linen and all other commodities. Marx defined this labor time as human labor in the abstract. Abstract because the exchange value of a commodity is not determined by what kind of specific or concrete labor went into making something, only how much of it was required. Whereas use values are defined by the how and the what of labor, exchange values are defined only by the how much. The market thus reduces specific kinds of labor. For example, assembling toaster ovens versus baking bread versus teaching a class into quantities of generalized abstract labor. Let me do a water break. Let's see if I don't think music is listening, so I will Just rise the volume a little bit. Yeah. There it is. Apologies for the ones that are listening to the recording on YouTube. So, you know what? Let me lower it a little bit. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, cool. So, let me go back to here. Already, yeah, to service. Okay. Baking is the type of concrete labor that results in bread. But an hour's worth of abstract labor determines that the value of the bread is commensurate with 1/10 of the value of a chair. And a toaster oven's price isn't determined by the fact that welding, electronics, mechanics, and assembly went into its production. It is measured only by the number of general or abstract hours of labor this adds up to. Simply put, you don't trade tailoring for mechanics at the store. You trade an hour for an hour. In Marx's poetic, if not entirely attractive imagery, labor is abstracted away from its unique qualitative form, then it congeals back into discernible quantities. He wrote, "The use values coat and linen are combinations of, on the one hand, productive activity with a definite purpose, and on the other, cloth and yarn. The values coat and linen, however, are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous labor. In the same way, the labor contained in these values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being an expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are the formative elements in the use values, coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only in so far as abstraction is made from their particular qualities, only in so far as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the two articles mentioned. Measurements of abstract labor may be easiest to see in their physical manifestations. The exertion of human energy can clearly transform or combine raw materials into finished products, but the same process is at work if the end result of the efforts is not a physical but a social commodity. The product might not be palpably tangible. It might be care performed on a patient. It might be knowledge conveyed to a student. But these outcomes, too, are the product of human labor. And therefore, the value of those outcomes is determined by the labor time necessary to generate them, just as it is for physical commodities. Service labor, just as other forms of labor, also becomes labor in the abstract. An hour's worth of tailoring produces a certain number of coats, just as an hour's worth of nursing equals some number of patients seen. An hour's worth of a teacher's labor produces a certain number of graded tests. An hour's worth of truck driving to deliver goods covers a certain number of miles, and so on and so on. Nor is the concept of value as determined by labor time disproved by the difference between relatively skilled and unskilled jobs. It is true that an hour of labor in a skilled industry does indeed contribute more value to a product than an hour of labor in an unskilled industry. The labor that goes into manufacturing a Boeing 737 jetliner produces more value than the labor that goes into making a hamburger. This is because you are paying for several layers of labor time. One can quickly master what goes into making a hamburger, but the learning curve that goes into being a machinist is steep. Therefore, the value of a machinist's labor includes the physical hours worked as well as the labor time that help produce their skills in the first place. The teachers, textbook mark makers, trainers, blueprint drafters, etc., who also contributed their labor to the education and preparation of a buoyant worker. Importantly, as in a parenthesis, this also creates an incentive within capitalism to innovate in order to de-skill labor, thereby making workers more replaceable and lowering the value of the specific labor in that industry. This also reminds me a little bit of there's this I remember there's an image of people like just in a staircase. It's a cartoon, I think, and one's pulling the other. They're basically pulling each other right to the top so that everyone can reach the top. Um, and there was a quote accompanied with this cartoon that said something like, every achievement that we get is a collective achievement. And I think that this explanation of how how of the labor theory of value uh, puts it in perspective really well, which is that the amount, like for example, you may say, it was my own efforts uh, that gave me that made me graduate, right? And in a way, I think sure, you worked your way to the top so that you could graduate and be the top of your class or whatever. Um, but to not recognize that the product of your achievement is as well a product of the achievements of others would be just complete ignorance and would deem you just, I would say, pretty selfish, right? Um, because as it says, the people that created textbooks, right? Uh, the teachers that taught you or not taught you maybe, and that was a valuable lesson for you, or maybe the teachers sucked or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But we're constantly uh, being told that it's your achievement, you should be proud of yourself, uh, and but this just reinforces the individualism. And I think that it's important also to recognize that the work of others has helped us, our work, in lots of different ways that we don't even uh, value. Talking about value, great. um, so the point remains that all labor boils down to units of abstract labor, even if they are now multiplied. Finally, it's important to note that Marx's intent was not to determine specific market prices. Prices form the starting point of bourgeois economics, which incidentally is why mainstream economists confuse more than they explain. We will explore in for future chapters some of the factors that contribute to the formation of prices. These appear at the surface of the system, but Marx was more interested in uncovering the underlying dynamics of capitalism, what drives value, how it is produced, and for whom. And then we go to the next subchapter, which is socially necessary labor time. I think I have three more subchapters, the conclusion, and a sidebar. And then next week we will read the chapter money. Interesting. Yeah, so just let me know if you're liking the content so far. I think that I mean, it's super basic. Obviously, this is not as complex as and as deep as the work that it's based on, which is pretty obvious. It's Das Capital, capital, but I think it's a super great summary to have accessible. Like the way that she writes, I think it's like incredibly clear and accessible. And actually, the conference that I shared on the chat with David Harvey, he says he gives a little bit of context into what was into a response that Marx gave to a, I think it was a random citizen. Um, but this person asked Marx like, "Hey, why don't you serialize capital, right? So that it could be much more accessible to workers." Because for Marx, the accessibility of his work was crucial. He wanted to make it as accessible as possible to the working class, above everything. But he, at the time, he was, there was the working class was pretty much illiterate, and they didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to write. So he he was thinking in he was thinking of the self-learned working class. So the people that were working class, but they also were self-taught and not they didn't have a formal education. Um, so for him that was crucial, and I think that one of the keys, also David Harvey mentions this as well, is that he wanted to make it so that because he knew that the French were also pretty uh, desperate to get to the bottom of whatever the ideas that were being discussed at the moment were was, and he wanted to just let sorry, my cat almost fell from the window. It's funny. um, and he wanted to so he wanted to give the first tome, like the first volume. He was just like, let's publish it as it is, the entirety of the volume, not serialized, because I know that the French were going to be disappointed if we serialize it and in the first part they don't get to the bottom of whatever Marx is trying to explain. Because if you notice, uh, it's just like Star Wars. Instead of starting from chapter 4, some people usually start on chapter 26, because that's the primitive accumulation chapter. I think we discussed this on the last week's stream. Anyways, yeah. So, uh, okay, yeah. Socially necessary labor time. So, the labor theory of value, that a commodity's value in relation to other commodities is determined by how much labor has gone into producing it, was not a controversial point during Marx's day. For this reason, he actually spent very little time explaining or defining the concept. The idea that labor is the source of wealth and value in society was considered an obvious point by classical political economists like David Ricardo and Adam Smith, which are, if you read a little bit of the context of Marx's Capital, was basically the two authors, the two economists that Marx based his work on Capital based on, right? So the first line of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is, "The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with necessaries and conveniences of life." And if Smith's words could be mistaken to be a rhetorical flourish, he fleshes the point out more explicitly later in the book. The real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What is bought with money or with goods is purchased by labor as much as we acquire by the toil of our own body. That money or those goods indeed save us this toil. They contain the value of a certain quantity of labor, which we exchange for what is supposed at the time to contain the value of an equal quantity. Labor was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor. That all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value, to those who possess it and those who want to exchange it for some new productions, is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which it can enable them to purchase or command. Ultimately, the classical economists did not delve far enough into this potentially revolutionary concept. Marx spent a lot of time taking apart their theories, showing what was worthwhile and where they fell short. And modern economists, who today function more as apologists for capitalism than as social scientists, have altogether thrown out the idea, fearing its explosive implications. While Smith, Ricardo, and others developed their ideas in a period before working-class struggle emerged, later economists had seen enough militancy and class struggle to fear the radical implications of working-class power. That's why mainstream economists today are known as neoclassical rather than classical economists. They profess dedication to the likes of Smith and Ricardo, but have discarded the troubling labor theory of value. After all, if the producers of wealth are laborers and not the bosses, then the popular slogan of May 1968, "The boss needs you, you don't need the boss," is not abstract hyperbole, but a concrete roadmap for the future. Marx's understanding of value was clearly more aligned to the classical bourgeois economists, who, writing at the early stages of capitalist development, were still genuinely trying to understand and explain the workings of the system. But where Smith and Ricardo left incomplete theories, Marx continued on, developing a social and economic framework on the basis of the labor theory of value. In order for this theory to be an effective analytical guide to understanding capitalism, Marx added a critical element, that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce it. The socially necessary labor time is the average amount of time that it takes to produce a commodity under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. That is to say, what is the average time using the common tools and technology within society that it will take to construct a table? If the average is 2 hours, then this determines the table's exchange value. Without understanding socially necessary labor time, value would be a completely subjective element. If, for instance, the author of this book, being, hopefully, a better writer than a table maker, decided to go into the table making business, my lack of skill and experience might translate into 8 hours of labor to produce a presumably shoddy table. But this does not mean that my table would be worth 4 times as much as a table made by an established firm that produces a quality table in 2 hours. It would simply mean I've wasted an extra 6 hours of my life, or all 8 in the likely case that no one wants to buy my shoddy table. Most, if not all, of the time that I took to make the table would be deemed wasted labor by the market. Socially necessary labor time, as its name implies, is socially and historically determined. How long it takes to produce something in a given society changes over time. IBM's first personal computer in the 1970s cost thousands of dollars to purchase and could perform relatively few tasks. Today, The technology available to build computers is much more advanced and therefore necessitates much less labor to create something a lot more complex. Now, you can buy a personal computer that is many times more powerful than its 1970s predecessor for less than $300. Value under capitalism changes over time. Further proof that it is not an inherent quality of the item, but socially determined. The regulation of value by the socially necessary labor time required to produce a given commodity takes on a force and momentum akin to the laws of nature. If tables are produced, on average, in 2 hours, all shoddy and inefficient table makers are forced to step up their techniques or bow out of table making. Marx writes, all different kinds of labor are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. The reason for this reduction is that in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce them asserts itself as a regulative law of nature. In the same way, the law of gravity asserts itself when a person's house collapses on top of him. We'll see how important this force of gravity is as we proceed. But the basic idea here is that if a corporation uses outdated techniques, lackadaisical, okay, that's a new word for me. Lackadaisical work routines or otherwise slow means to produce goods, it will discover bankruptcy as quickly as a house lacking proper construction will discover gravity. As socialist Alex Kalinikos put it, the pressure of competition forces producers to adopt similar methods of production to their rivals, or find themselves undercut. A graphic design company would be historically obsolete if it designed websites from scratch using HTML tables. And a mining company that does not utilize the new and dangerous remote control and automation methods in mining would not be competitive. Incidentally, a good reason to force safety regulations in industries rather than expecting the laws of the market to help companies regulate themselves. Great. We're going to talk about then of generations of labor. Water break. Just give a quick look at the Discord. Okay, cool. Moving on to generations of labor. The value of a commodity is not solely determined by the labor that directly produced it. The worth of a table, a jetliner, or an iPhone must also include the raw materials, tools, and technology used in the production of these commodities, from wood to turbines to microchips. But these raw materials and machinery are themselves commodities created by labor. As such, they all carry their own labor-determined value into the production of a new commodity. Essentially, their value simply gets passed into the value of the table, the jetliner, or iPhone. To explain the point, it's useful to distinguish between what Marx identified as living labor, human labor that goes into the production of a commodity in the present time, and dead labor, the previous generations of labor that carry past value into the process of production. Let's go back to the table making example. I said arbitrarily, but for the sake of simplicity, that it would take, on average, 2 hours of labor, including design and manufacture, to make a table. But in order to produce a table, a furniture company will also have to buy materials: wood planks, glue, screws, and equipment, power saws, clamps, sanders, factory belts, and computer programs that generate cutting specifications. Let's say that 45 minutes of labor produced the amount of wood used, and another 15 minutes of labor generated the glue, screws, etc. used for making one table. That's another hour's worth of labor that is hitting in the production process. The raw materials simply pass on their value into a new product, the table. Similarly, the value of the equipment used adds a fraction of its value to every round of production. Why a fraction? Take, for example, the value of a factory standard white belt sander. It costs about 12,000. Assume, again arbitrarily, that an average sander lasts for about 4 years before it becomes too worn out to be effectively used. That means that each year the machine transfers about a quarter of its value to the tables that it sands. During its lifespan, it will, the capitalists hope, pass its full value into the goods it's used to produce. By the time we add in the labor passed on from all other machinery and rent paid for the factory in which it's manufactured, its value will be greater still. The point of this very hypothetical example is, of course, not to determine exact prices, but to show how every component and input into production is measured by socially necessary labor time. Understanding that previous generations of labor embodied in the equipment and materials are dead labor, but labor nonetheless, highlights the point that workers create value, not as mainstream economics asserts, a combination of capitalist ingenuity, technology, and, perhaps, a nod to the workers manning that technology. And insofar as they are dead labor, they pass on only the value that was already imbued in them in the past. They cannot, like labor, create new wealth, as Marx explained. A machine is not active in the labor process. A machine which is not active in the labor process is useless. In addition, it falls prey to the destructive power of natural processes. Iron rusts, wood rots, yarn with which we neither weave nor knit is cotton wasted. Living labor must seize upon these things, awaken them from the dead, change them from merely possible into real and effective use values. Bathed in the fire of labor, appropriated as part of its organism, and infused with vital energy for the performance of the functions appropriate to their concept and to their vocation in the process, they are indeed consumed, but to some purpose, as elements in the formation of new use values, new products which are capable of entering into individual consumption as means of subsistence, or into a new labor process as means of production. Now, we move on to money and fetishism. If you have, feel free to drop any comments. See, the chat's pretty empty. But anyways, I think you should still be able to see the Discord and the live session that I shared of David Harvey, if you're interested in watching that later. Cool. Money and fetishism. If we start from this understanding of value rather than with a surface appearance of prices, the real character of money loses its mystique. Value, which is just a crystallization of abstract labor, is represented by money. We'll see in the next chapter that money itself is a commodity, which by custom and circumstance has become a universal measure against which all other items on the market are exchanged. Instead of saying that it takes an equal amount of time to produce a ballpoint pen as a lifesaver's candy, we can simply say that they both have a value of 10 cents. Thus, by being a portable and universal embodiment of value, money simplifies and mediates the process of trading goods. In Marx's words, money necessarily crystallizes out of the process of exchange. As markets developed, money became a convenient and necessary substitute for simple barters of commodities based on socially agreed upon labor times. With money, a producer of bread doesn't have to go to the marketplace with 10 loaves of bread in order to buy a chair. At the same time, a chair maker doesn't need to exchange her chair for 10 loaves of bread if she only wants one today and another loaf later in the week. Money conveniently stores value over time, which its owner can dispense of as he or she sees fit. Money also conceals the true nature of value, so that when you go to the supermarket, you don't think you're trading an equivalent amount of your congealed mass of labor with someone else's. As David Harvey explained, you go into a supermarket and you want to buy a head of lettuce. In order to buy the lettuce, you have to put down a certain sum of money. The material relation between the money and the lettuce expresses a social relation because the price, the how much, is socially determined, and the price is a monetary representation of value. Hidden within this market exchange of things is a relation between you, the consumer, and the direct producers, those who labor to produce the lettuce. The end result is that our social relation to the laboring activities of others is disguised in the relationships between things. You cannot, for example, figure out in the supermarket whether the lettuce has been produced by happy laborers, miserable laborers, slave laborers, wage laborers, or some self-employed peasant. The lettuces are mute, as it were, as to how they were produced and who produced them. So I don't know why I just thought that it's a similar case to when you're trying to buy, just free pasture meat. There's really no guarantee that you are getting actually free pasture meat, right? I mean, they can have a few seals of approval, but you don't really know how they treat them, right? The animals, and point to the vegetarians, I guess. They probably are not still treated pretty well. So yeah. Anyways, random thought. The real social relations of production and exchange are therefore hidden behind a veil of what appears to be a relationship between money and commodities. Instead of human relationships, we have economic relationships between goods. Or as Marx put it, it is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. The hidden relations of production, wage labor, and, as we'll see, exploitation behind this fantastic form are specified in peculiar characteristics of capitalism. They did not exist in pre-capitalist societies, which, despite their brutality, lacked the cloak of fairness that capitalism purports. The process of producing commodities, Marx wrote, has mastery over man instead of the opposite. This is the essence of what Marx dubbed commodity fetishism. What other way can you describe the modern worship of every new generation of Apple products than fetishism? We idolize these things that we consider to be outside and external to us, but in fact are our own creations. By using the term fetishism, Marx was also taking a jab at the philosophers of the Enlightenment, who saw superstition as primitive and hailed the rationality of capitalism. The thinkers of Enlightenment promoted science and logic, yet had no problem with a warped reality in which things are powerful and valuable, while human beings relate to each other through the exchange of those things. So, what I think I'll do is that since there is a sidebar uh, before the conclusion, I'm going to go ahead and read the sidebar and then finish with the conclusion because that makes more sense, I think. So, at the waste of society, production has expanded exponentially since Marx's time. Our society bursts at the seams with commodities. The drive to make commodities in order to sell them rather than to directly consume them gives us a clue as to why the production of commodities expands over the long term. We'll discuss this further in chapter 5, but the essence is that while there may be a limit to how much one feudal lord and his family can consume, production for the market knows no such natural bounds. Capitalism has left no stone unturned in its quest to commodify all living and non living matter on the planet, from those as plentiful and mundane as water to those as absurd and abstract as Wall Street's financial cocktails. If there is a dollar to be made, capitalism will find a way to package it up and sell it. One way to measure the phenomenal growth of commodities produced under capitalism is to measure the size of our landfills, which now number about 2,000 across the country, logging in 265 million metric tons of waste. Of course, official landfills don't capture the total amount of commodity production and waste, since much of our waste doesn't end up in landfills. One extreme example is known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a floating island of debris in the Pacific Ocean so large it is visible from space. This drifting stew of junk stretches across an area larger than the state of Texas. Along with the wealth of society comes the waste of society. Every year, the amount of paper and plastic cups, forks, and spoons used in the United States alone could circle the equator 300 times. There is also a yearly average of about 380 billion plastic bags and wraps, which themselves require 12 million barrels of oil to create. According to Heather Rogers, every American discards more than 1,600 pounds of rubbish a year, more than 4.5 pounds per person per day. Starting in 1960, the U.S. government's Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has measured the country's total municipal solid waste, essentially the everyday items that make up our garbage, which are food and yard waste, packaging, office paper, clothing, etc. In 2017, we produced 268 million tons of waste, up from just 88 million tons 6 decades ago. Of course, municipal garbage is itself a tiny fraction of the overall waste produced, most of which is generated by industry. But unlike municipal waste, industrial waste is largely untracked. An oft quoted but vastly out of date EPA study in the 1980s found that about 7.6 billion tons of manufacturing waste is created annually. This conservative estimate is the equivalent weight of over 20,000 Empire State Buildings, but a lot more toxic. This dramatic increase in annual waste mirrors an overall trend of the system to produce ever-growing amounts of commodities for sale in ever-expanding markets. Take the automobile industry. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, there were 74 million automobiles registered in the United States in 1960. By 2017, that number nearly quadrupled to 272 million. More than 96 million automobiles were produced worldwide in 2017 alone. Similarly, in plastics, 381 million tons of plastic were produced annually around the world in 2015, a 200-fold increase since 1950. To put it in context, wrote researchers Hannah Ritchie and Max Roser, this is roughly equivalent to the mass of 2/3 of the world population. A 2014 study found that there were more than 5 trillion pieces of plastic floating in our oceans. That number is surely larger today. The explosion of goods in modern society is not only the result of a growing number of commodities in any given market, but also a consequence of the number of things which are now considered marketable. The types of things that are now for sale continue to increase as capitalism commodifies a greater and greater share of our lives. This has happened through the privatization of things like healthcare and education, which used to be outside the laws of the capitalist market. It has also happened by attaching a price tag to things that previously had none. Rather than finding collective solutions to social problems, all issues are subjugated to the machinations of the market. Corporations can now buy credits to pollute past regulatory standards through the emissions trading market. Thus, November 2012 was the unsettling occasion of the country's first ever auction of greenhouse gas pollution credits in California. The market expands further as it insinuates commercial value to women's bodies and sex on advertisements, and it reaches into every realm of society, taking previously counterculture activities like skateboarding and hawking, thousands of magazines, video games, sneakers, and paraphernalia. Kids in the 1980s who made their own ramps to do tricks at home and punks who skated in the 1990s can now buy skateboarding-themed ceramic travel mugs online for $24.95. Along with this expansion comes the ideology of the market, as we all know, as the know-it-all and cure-all for society's needs, as David Harvey explains. To presume that markets and market signals can best determine all allocative decisions is to presume that everything can, in principle, be treated as a commodity. Commodification presumes the existence of property rights over processes, things, and social relations, that a price can be put on them and that they can be traded subject to legal contract. The market is presumed to work as an appropriate guide and ethic for all human action. And now for the conclusion, before I will drink. Great. So, conclusion. We have traced here the basic contours of Marx's theory of value. We can see now that capitalism is a system where social relations are determined by and subordinated to the exchange of commodities. Sorry, my cat is here. She says hi. At least her tail is. So, okay. But it is each of these commodities has a use value, whether good, which is fruit, whether good, bad, fruits, or nuclear arsenals, or indifferent, garbage, pail kids. But it is exchange value that concerns capitalists and becomes a criteria through which society determines what is or isn't produced, what is or isn't worth investment. Yet, despite the fact that our lives seem to be at the mercy of inanimate exchange values, the role of labor in determining these values has a powerful and revolutionary implications. We'll explore the role of labor more fully in future chapters. But first, in order to further demystify the machinations of the system, we'll follow the scent of money and see exactly how it is that the coagulated state of value congeals into bales of paper that can be stacked in your wallet or electronically digitized in the bank. That is Chapter 2 of A People's Guide to Capitalism. Chapter 2 is the labor theory of value. Pretty relevant still in today's world, today's capitalist societies. I hope you like this reading. This is a new format that we're exploring. I know Ernesto's not here. He had to make a recording. Actually, I think I'll also share it in the chat, because I know that as his comrade and friend, I am very proud that he is publishing a book along with the great minds of Ben Burgis, McManus. Flowers for Marx. Great. So you can actually pre-order this. So I'll share the link here. This is from Rebel Press. Flowers of Marx, which is from Conrad Hamilton, McManus, Ben Burgis, Ernesto Vargas, and the preface is made by Daniel Tutt, which is all of those people are pretty big Marxists in today's postmodern world. So these are the postmodern neo-Marxists that we're talking about. Anyways, I encourage you to pre-order the book. And yeah, for sure. Definitely do that. And also, again, if you're interested in reading the book that we're currently live reading, A People's Guide to Capitalism, An Introduction to Marxist Economics by Hadas Thier, then you can join our Discord in the link that I shared in the chat. I will pin this again. And I appreciate y'all for joining. And I will see you hopefully later this week.